Good evening. Thank you for joining us here for another inner hour. Appreciate your being here. I'm going to, as I do, light a little candle before we start. Gives me a moment to kind of collect myself and focus on being present here with you, and invite you to do the same if you like. So here we go. Alrighty. So we're continuing this week in our series, What Did Yeshua and His Apostles Really Teach? And if you've not been able to join us up to now, you feel free to, if I mention things that you don't understand the references to ask a question, or you can always email me too later. Speaking of which, I appreciate getting emails and suggestions and comments. A couple of you did that this week, which is great. One of the questions that came up, which we won't do tonight, but we will actually touch on, is, so if what we're talking about in terms of the succession of the leadership of the Yeshua movement not falling to Peter and Paul, which is the Roman Catholic tradition, if that's historically really not what happened, and it went to James and then through this other succession of things that we'll be talking about. So what about Peter and Paul? What happened with them, and how did they die, and what did they do, and all that? So because that's not directly this topic, we will get to that, but not tonight. And then also it brought up, because I had mentioned a figure in the Bible named Melchizedek, which is usually written as one word in the English translations, Melchizedek, which is actually a combination of two Hebrew words, Malki and Zadok, which means literally King of Righteousness. He's a very mysterious and very powerful figure in both the Jewish Hebrew Bible and in the Christian New Testament also, though what's written about him is very cryptic and kind of short. So we'll touch on him a little bit more too, but not tonight either. But I appreciate the suggestion, and we will get around to them. Actually, the person suggested that I don't see online at the moment. So, but anyway, we'll get to that, and either at the end of this series, or we might do a very short thing just on Melchizedek and Roman Catholic Church, the early, not the church as it is, but the early foundations of it, and what the story about Peter and Paul is. So tonight, we're continuing, though, with what Yeshua and his apostles really taught, based on historical evidence that's now available both from archaeology and biblical scholarship. And the group we're going to be talking about tonight is called the Ebionites, which is probably not a familiar term to most of you if you grew up in, well, probably not a familiar term to most of you. They were a very, very significant but small group, and they did not exist until after the death of Yeshua, and they existed until the Second Jewish Revolt in 135 BC, AD, sorry. And we can talk about what happened to them historically too, although you can look that up. So I want to share some historical information briefly, just kind of who they were, and then more importantly to me for this particular series, I want to talk about what they believed and what they practiced. So first of all, the what's called Ebionite community, sometimes early on they were also called Nazarenes, and it's confusing because historically multiple and quite different groups were referred to as Nazarenes or Nazorenes. So I want to talk about that briefly in case you do decide to study some on this and you're not confused. Nazarene, in the sense that Jesus is from Nazareth, is where most people think that comes from, which really it does not, although it has the same Hebrew root word, which is netzer, and it means branch, basically. because in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament as well, when we're talking about the Messianic line, it's referred to as a branch of David, the root of Jesse. And so the branch analogy is used a lot. Yeshua uses it a lot as well. I'm the true vine, blah, 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 blah. You're the branches. So that analogy is used quite a bit. So the idea, and also because once the prophets died out, between the end of the Hebrew Bible and the beginning of the New Testament, there's an intertestamental period. During that period when there was no more prophecy in Israel, that's an in quote thing, but that's how it was described. Once that happened, then the remnant of true Israel began to be talked about a lot in Jewish writings, particularly apocryphal or the ones that believed the end of the age or end of the world was near. That was used a lot, and the root or the remnant all refers to this branch of the Messianic line of David, basically. And so the Ebionites were called Nazarenes in that sense. They were like, you might call them branchites today. They consider themselves the true remnant of Israel, the true keepers of the teachings and practices of Yeshua. And they're very early on. They started around 70 AD, probably a little earlier actually, but we know from writings then that they were in existence then, and we'll again maybe talk a little bit more about that. The word Ebionite, or some people pronounce it Ebionite, the Ebionites were, that's an anglicized word that comes from a Greek word ebionim, which means the poor or the poor ones. Most scholars believe that was a title others gave them, and it is a title, interestingly enough, that the Essenes that we've talked about before they're also called ebionim, or the poor ones. And not because they took vows of poverty. That's a much later church thing, particularly the Catholic Church. But the poor meant, blessed are the poor in spirit, for those of the kingdom of God. The idea of humility and that not having arrogance and so on. That was where this term came from, both for the Essenes and for the Ebionites. In other words, they were noted for their humility and their kindness, strength but kindness. So there seems to be evidence that when they thought of or referred to themselves, they didn't use that word typically. Kind of be weird for humble people to call themselves the humble people, but they typically use yachad, which was one of the Hebrew words that was used to mean community, or its root means oneness, basically. But it was used to describe a kind of a oneness of belief and heart and practice, a spiritual community. That they referred to themselves that way quite often. So did the Essene order, as we talked about in the previous ones. And both groups also called themselves followers of the Way, W-A-Y, which is what the original disciples and followers of Yeshua in the New Testament are referred to, followers of the Way. So all these groups, the very original followers of Yeshua, the apostles, his family and his friends, and the Essene order prior to him, and then the Ebionites after Yeshua, all shared those same titles and all really saw themselves as the true remnant of Israel. So that's where the name came from. So let me tell you a little bit very briefly about the history. So Yeshua comes along, and he doesn't just start out cold and create a movement. He's part of the movement of John the Baptist. John the Baptist, according to Jewish historians in first century and later as well, had a very large following. According to some, like Josephus and Philo, perhaps as many as 5,000 or 6,000 followers, which was large back then. Which was one of the reasons he was a threat to King Herod, the Jewish king, and also to Caesar, the Roman king, because here's another guy who's talking about a kingdom, and you don't talk about kingdoms while you're living under Roman dominion, or a crazy person like King Herod. So John the Baptist had a really large spiritual movement, and Yeshua was part of that movement. Yeshua's first disciples that we know of, according to the New Testament, were also part of the John the Baptizer movement, and did not leave John the Baptizer until Jesus started teaching. Jesus was baptized, by all accounts, by John the Baptist in the River Jordan, and that's when he has this experience of seeing the Holy Spirit descend on him and remain on him. That's historically and spiritually significant within Judaism, because in the Judaism of his day, the Holy Spirit, Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit was considered to descend upon the prophets, to empower them with the wisdom and clarity and strength to do their appointed work or mission or message. But it would come upon them and depart from them. It was a transient thing. It was temporary for them. And one of the unique things about Yeshua, and also one of the unique things prophesied about the Messiah, is that the Holy Spirit would not come and depart. Once the Holy Spirit would come and rest on him or remain on him, which is exactly the phraseology used to describe what happened to Yeshua at his baptism, that it came and rested on him and remained with him. So that was more significant even than a prophet, and was another messianic sign. So for a very short time, John the Baptist and Jesus were both teaching simultaneously, most of the apostles, or most of the followers, being John's disciples. Once John was arrested and understood he was going to be killed, and then was killed, he instructed his own disciples to go to Yeshua as their teacher. And many of them did. Many of them resisted that and refused to do so. And so there were people that did not move from John to Yeshua, but many did. And then Yeshua also began to call his own, some of whom were from John's flock and some of whom were not. And so Yeshua gathered his own in addition to those of John's who came over with him. But it was a singular movement. John the Baptist and the Jesus movement were not two different movements. It was a singular movement at the time. Both movements, John's and Yeshua's, were hated by King Herod. He felt both of them were threats to his throne. Rome had actually put him in the kingship position in Israel. He was not rightful king of Israel, and Jews at the time did not accept him as that. He was only half Jewish in the first place. But he was a puppet of Rome, basically, to help with administration in Judea. All of Israel, actually. But anyway, so he hated them and feared them, and the followers of Yeshua and everybody looked upon Herod as a false king and a Roman puppet, and they despised him. So there's a lot of animosity there. So let me see if there's anything else historically that I think we need to touch on. The other part of Nazarene that I didn't mention, I guess I should just for clarity, is that there's another word, Nazarene, and it does not come from Netzer, and it does not mean branch, and it's completely disconnected. Sadly, in English, they look the same and are spelled the same, but it comes from a completely different Hebrew root, and it was somebody who took the Nazorite vow, which was a temporary spiritual vow taken for the purposes of ritual purification. And there are several components to it. I won't go into all that because it's not really relevant. It's just a completely different thing than a Nazarene group. A Nazarite vow was typically a year, and there were several things they didn't do. They wouldn't partake of any alcohol. They were celibate for a year. There were a number, and they went to the temple and did sacrifices and paid for other people's sacrifices. There were a number of things associated with the Nazarite vow, but none of which are associated with the Ebionites or the group called the Nazarenes. Very different situation. So The Ebionites believed that Yeshua was absolutely the promised Jewish Messiah. They believed he was the true teacher. The Essene order 100 years prior taught that there was a teacher of righteousness within their own community at the time, and that there'd be another successor teacher of righteousness, or true teacher, or teacher of the way, or a prince of righteousness, all of which were titles that were basically applied to Yeshua too in his own time. So, as far as the movement itself, here's a few things in terms of what they actually believed and what they lived and practiced, which distinguish them right off the bat from anybody in Paul's group. We'll get to Paul in a moment. And it distinguishes them radically once the church, ecclesiastical church, which became the Roman Catholic, as that began to grow out of Paul's teachings, radically different beliefs about Jesus right from the get-go, which is why you don't see much of the Ebionite teachings, if any, in the New Testament, because they didn't look at him the way the New Testament looks at him. As also other Gospels we've now found that did not make it into the New Testament, and other letters that didn't make it in. The letters of Clement 1 and 2, the letters of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, Philip, Mary Magdalene, secret Gospel of Mark, a number of other things that didn't make it in the New Testament, is not because they were not known at the time. Some of them were later, but most of them were known at the time. They didn't make it in as the New Testament was being canonized because they didn't fit the picture the New Testament was trying to present of Yeshua and who he was. So, the Ebionites. The Ebionites believed, first of all, that Jesus was not born of a virgin. Absolutely rejected that. They believed he was born like any other human being, that he was born to a man and a woman, the woman being Mary and the man being Joseph. Now, there is some confusion as to whether Joseph was his biological father or his biological, I shouldn't say that, his stepfather. There's confusion in the early writings about the family as to, was Joseph already a widower, if a man is a widower, right? Was he already a widower when he married Mary and already had children? So the brothers and sisters in the New Testament would be step-brothers and sisters of Yeshua. Or were Mary and Joseph, did they conceive all those children together? There is actually some lack of clarity about that historically, but there's, in the Ebionite movement, no doubt whatsoever that he had a human father. So, and most believed Joseph was the father, but they're, again, not 100% clear historically. They also believed that he was the prophet Moses foretold. There will be a prophet like unto me that God sends again in the future, and he will do blah, 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 blah. It's in Deuteronomy, and it was a prophecy Moses mentioned more than once before his own death. And they believed Yeshua was that prophet. He was the next great prophet after Moses. And all the other intervening prophets, Isaiah, Zechariah, and all of them. The other thing which distinguished the Ebionites from later Christian groups who believed in Jesus was that they were complete vegetarians. And the Ebionites taught that Yeshua himself was a vegetarian. And that sounds kind of ridiculous to most of us who've grown up with him eating fish and different things. But they did teach that he was vegetarian and that he taught vegetarianism. And they go back to two things for that. One is that Yeshua was radically opposed to animal sacrifice, which he was, and there seems to be some evidence of that in the New Testament, and quite a bit of historical evidence written about him and his reaction to animal sacrifices outside the New Testament. One of the things he did that got him arrested and ultimately killed was the whole money changer incident in the temple, which people don't think of as being associated with animal sacrifice, but it was. And in that same record of the New Testament, he does not just throw out the money changers. He also opens all the animal cages and lets them all go, which really infuriates animal sellers. So just, again, very briefly, there were required sacrifices in the Jewish temple by the law of Moses. And some of those sacrifices required animal sacrifices. So people would bring animals to the temple to be sacrificed, depending on the type of sacrifice, the purpose of that sacrifice, and so on. All this is very spelled out and detailed. So if you did not have the money to bring an unblemished something, a dove, a calf, a goat, whatever it might be you were sacrificing, if you could not afford to do that, or for some other reason couldn't transport them from where you lived to the temple, it had to be done in the temple, then at the temple you could buy animals for sacrifice that met all the ritual requirements of sacrificial animals. You could buy them, and the priest would sacrifice them for you. But because Jerusalem was in Judea, and Judea was part of the Roman occupation, you were not allowed to carry anything but Roman coin in Israel. So you could not carry Hebrew coin. You could only carry Roman coin. You could not carry Roman coin into the temple to buy the animals you needed to sacrifice, because that was considered defilement of the temple. You could only carry Hebrew coin. So the answer to that dilemma was money changers. At the gates of the temple, the money changers and animal sellers were set up. They would take your Roman coin, which you must carry anywhere else in your life in Israel, take that and exchange it for Hebrew coin, which you could then carry legitimately into the temple, buy the animals, and do the sacrifice. So Yeshua is objecting to that entire practice, the animal slaughter and the money changers, because the money changers charged exorbitant exchange rates. Let's just say in American dollars, I wanted to give you $5 to buy this animal, and so I give you the $5, and then you give me the Hebrew equivalent of that, but instead of giving me $5 worth, you give me $1 worth. So I have to give you $25 worth to get a $5 value. You follow me? So they were getting rich off the people trying to make sacrifices. So Yeshua is very opposed to all that. The other and main reason that the Ebionites practice vegetarianism is they were big on in the beginning. This is what God set up in the beginning. Yeshua is big on that too. When people ask him questions about the law or the Torah or the code of laws of Moses, about, for example, is divorce acceptable? There's a passage in the New Testament where that's brought up. Yeshua says, it is now, and it's acceptable according to the law of Moses, but it was not so in the beginning. In the beginning, so Yeshua couches many of his answers in those terms. In the beginning, it was not so, or in the beginning, it was like this. And he describes what's described in the early books of Genesis as the God's plan. And in the first book of Genesis, nobody eats meat. People don't eat meat. Animals don't eat meat. There are no carnivores. Every living, breathing creature in Genesis 1 has a vegetarian diet. They're to eat grasses of the fields, herbs of the fields, fruits of the trees. They don't eat each other or animals. And so in the beginning, by God's design, the Ebionites go, well, if that's what God wanted, that's what we're doing. And so that was their primary thing, was we're supposed to have a vegetarian diet. That vegetarian diet established in Genesis 1 continues all the way through until the great flood in Noah's era. And after the flood, it's specifically mentioned in Torah that there was no vegetation because the flood no animals, because the flood had wiped out almost all animal life, and it was very hard to find animals, so you couldn't eat meat. There was no animals to hunt. So basically, and no vegetation to eat. So the animals that they brought with them, which were, according to the story, are reproducing, and they're allowed to eat those because they can't find food. The flood has kind of destroyed everything. Vegetables, fruit trees, animals, it's pretty much wiped out. So they were allowed to eat meat because there wasn't a readily available non-meat source big enough to sustain everyone. That's when it changed biblical to eating meat. And so the Ebionites decided they were going to practice vegetarianism, and they advocated vegetarianism. They hated the idea of animal cruelty or animal slaughter. Another thing that differentiated them was they were profoundly dedicated to practicing the Torah, as was Yeshua. Yeshua was a Torah-observant Jew his entire life until his death, as were his apostles. The ones he chose, not the false apostle Paul, who named himself an apostle, as opposed to Jesus training him and teaching him like he did the others. So they believed in following the Torah. The followers of Paul were mostly not Jews, especially if his movement got growing, and they didn't want to follow the Torah. The men certainly did not want to be circumcised, so Paul did away with that requirement. They did not want to follow kosher diet, so Paul did away with that requirement. And so basically many of the requirements of Torah that were important for Jews to do, Paul said to his growing community of non-Jewish believers in what Paul taught about Jesus, you don't have to do that stuff. So the Jewish people who followed Yeshua were very upset with Paul, going, what are you doing? Teaching that they don't have to do this. Of course they do. And when Jesus was alive, he did not take, so far as we know, nothing has been discovered contrary to this yet. I don't think there will be, but at least yet there hasn't been. Yeshua took no non-Jewish disciples, period, in his lifetime. He even says to his disciples before he dies, do not go to any Gentiles or Gentile territory. Go only to the Jews of the house of Israel. Pretty clear instruction. So the other thing that the Ebionites believed in was that Yeshua taught the Torah was going to be in existence through all time. It was binding for all time. Yeshua does in fact say that in the Sermon on the Mount section in Matthew. I think it's Matthew 5, it might be 6 where he says it, but it's Matthew 5, 6, and 7. He specifically does in fact say exactly that. The other thing that the Ebionites said, which definitely distinguished them from other groups and from the growing Gentile believer group of Paul's, was as Paul got better known and his group got larger and larger, and it became clear he was not insisting upon following the Torah, and that he was teaching a very different Jesus than the apostles themselves had known and had trained with for 3.5 years and were continuing to teach. The Ebionite group said very clearly, Paul is an apostate. He has turned his back on the Torah, and he is a false teacher. He's a false prophet, and you should not listen to him. So they're very adamant about that, and they didn't mince any words about it in their writings, which again did not endear them to the Pauline communities by any stretch, or as it developed later on, the Roman Catholic Church, who looked upon the Ebionites and their successive generations of groups that kind of grew out of them. They were always, by the Roman Catholic Church, considered heretics and were outcast, and in many cases severely persecuted. So the Ebionite group, where did that come from? So Yeshua's teaching, he's got John's disciples, many of them, and his own as well, and it's a large movement. Then Yeshua is killed by the Romans. And before he dies, he passes the leadership on to his blood brother, James. We know that not only from sources outside the Bible, but from the New Testament itself in the book of Acts. It specifically says that James took over the Jerusalem church, which, by the way, was not called the Jerusalem church in their lifetime. It was called the Synagogue of the Apostles, and because it was a synagogue, it wasn't a church. And they did the synagogue liturgy of the time, and interspersed a lot of Yeshua's teachings in those teachings. So the Synagogue of the Apostles, which was located in Jerusalem, in the house where the Last Supper was held, so-called the upper room, that house is a wealthy person's house. Probably in Jesus' family, that's another story though. but it was probably his aunt and uncle's house. And that's still there, by the way. They know where that house is. It's been excavated, and some of it's been kind of renovated. That's not really the right word, but anyway, archaeologically, we know where that is now. And that's where the movement was. That's where James lived. That's where Mother Mary moved and lived. That's where the movement ran from while James was alive. And he was clearly the head of the council. Even in Acts, he's clearly the head of the council, and his decision stands. Now, there's a council of elders, a council of 12 elders, that is also set up that helps him, and they have discussions, but the final decision is always James. And you see that in the book of Acts, in the places where Paul is summoned by them to called to account for his false teaching, and then a compromise is reached. That happens twice. But anyway, James was clearly the head of the church. The non-canonical Gospels, like Thomas and Philip, make it really clear that Yeshua continues to instruct his followers to go to James as their authority now that Jesus is gone. So he was the head of that. James was the head of that until he himself was killed by the priests, not by the Romans. And I've forgotten the date. You can look it up. I want to say 62 AD. But it was about 30 years after Jesus was killed, until James was killed. And he was killed by being thrown off the highest tower of the temple, and then was killed by the priests who were upset with him. There's more about James and his connection to the priesthood that we can do. Maybe we'll do a special on James, because most Christians don't know much about him. And there's quite a bit known about him historically. Remarkable person. There's evidence that he was setting himself up as high priest of Israel by the blood lineage that he and his brothers shared, and that's what got him killed. But that's another story outside of this. What we do know is that James ran the movement based on what his brother taught until he himself was killed. And at that point, the group of Yeshua's apostles that were still alive, which were many of them at that point, and the group of Yeshua's family, many of whom were still alive, including his mother at that time, and many of the new students and followers that had come in since James, that whole group continued the teachings of James and the teachings of Yeshua, and continued and carried on. And there was another person appointed in charge of it. His name was Simeon. Simeon, we know historically, was Yeshua's blood cousin. Yeshua's uncle and aunt had a son named Simeon, who would have been Jesus' cousin. And he took over the movement after James. That's not even disputed historically, until he himself was killed. And then there's a lineage like that happens, and we know who those were. But the point is, during that era, in the transition from James to Simeon, the group began to be known as the Poor Ones, or the Ebionites, and they were called that for quite a while. And they continued to exist from that point. And then after James was killed, then the initial Jewish revolt happened shortly after James's death. And then at that point in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, and it was terrible. And so they began to go into hiding, and because they were persecuted. And so they left that whole area, and they went to an area called Pella, which is a valley where John the Baptist lived and hid and baptized for many years before his death. And it's right outside of a huge city, which was a Greek-Roman city, not a Jewish one, called Decapolis. So you can look on maps and see all that. So anyway, so this group called the Ebionites continued until the second great Jewish revolt in around 135, led by Bar Kokhba. And then the Jews were just kind of obliterated, and Jerusalem was flattened, and Judaism was a capital crime. And it begins to, the historical trail begins to disperse there. It gets really hard to figure out what happened after that. It gets quite confusing. So let me tell you a little bit about what they wrote and what they believed, because we do know some of that. And they had a set of teachings called the Gospel of the Ebionites, also called the Gospel of the Hebrews, because, again, almost all of this group were Hebrews, Jewish people. And if Gentiles did join their group, they had to convert to become Jews and follow the Torah to join the group. So the Gospel of Hebrews we know about because the enemies of this group, the people who followed Paul, wrote extensively about it because they hated them and wanted them wiped out and thought they were all false teachers. We don't have a Gospel of Ebionites anymore, or Gospel of Hebrews, same thing, but we have lots of records about it existing. What we have are just seven fragments of it written about by Tertullian, Origen, and other, I just forgot the Eusebius. Some of the earlier church historians write about it. So we have some fragments of it where they're quoting it. So I want to read you those briefly to give you a sense of what they believed. So this is known now as Fragment 1, and it says, I'm quoting, "When Christ wished to come upon the earth, our Father summoned the mightiest power in heaven, who was called Michael, and entrusted Christ into his care." Michael is an archangel. "As that power came into the world, then one called Mary came forth, and Christ was in her womb over 7 months." That's the entire Fragment 1 from the Gospel of Ebionites. Fragment 2 says this, and these aren't sadly sequential, it's excerpts from this whole book, the whole Gospel. Fragment 2, "It came to pass, when the Lord came up out of the water," this is describing Yeshua's baptism by John the Baptist. "It came to pass, when our Lord came up out of the water, that the whole fountain of the Holy Spirit, in its entirety, descended upon him and rested on him and remained on him." I mentioned that a minute ago. "And said to him, My son, in all the prophets before you, I was waiting for you to come, that I might finally rest and live in thee. Thou art my rest. You have become my son who will reign forever." So that's a different version of the baptism, and a very early one of the baptism of Jesus, earlier than what we have in the Gospels. Okie dokie. Fragment 3 says, this is now Yeshua talking, and I don't know what this means. It's one sentence, and it says, "Even so did my mother, the Holy Spirit, take me by my hair and carry me to the great mountain Tabor." I don't know what that means, but I can tell you this. Mount Tabor was one of the 3 famous mountains in Israel at the time, and it's the one that had a very large Essene settlement on it. So here again is a connection between Yeshua and the Essenes. Fragment 4 says, "He marvels that he should reign, and that he shall continue to reign until there is ultimate rest." Again, that's it. That's the whole fragment. Another fragment says, "He that seeks will not rest until he finds, and he that finds shall marvel, and he that marvels shall eventually reign, and he that reigns shall one day rest." That fragment is very similar to a quote from the Gospel of Thomas. The rest of the fragments. "Never be joyful." Here's an interesting one. "Never be joyful until you can behold your brother with love." That to me is a very interesting one, very much in line with the whole loving kindness idea of Yeshua's, and love is the fulfilling of the law, and so on. Here's fragment 6. "The most grievous of all offenses is to grieve the spirit of one's brother," and not meaning familial brother, but spiritual brother. And the last fragment is this. When the Lord had given the linen cloth to the servant of the priest, he went to James and appeared to him. So now the Lord they're talking about here is Yeshua. James they're talking about here is his brother James, who took over the movement. And Yeshua appeared to James. James had sworn that he would not eat from that hour that he had drunk from the cup with the Lord until he saw him risen. And shortly thereafter, Yeshua appeared to James and said, "Bring a table and bread for him." And then he took the bread and blessed it and gave it to James the just, James the Zadok, James the righteous, and said to him, "My brother, you may now eat, for the Son of Man has risen." So, that's the last fragment. One of the interesting indications of this is that James the brother was at the Last Supper, because this idea of we're not going to eat until we see you risen is something that's in a number of Last Supper testimonials, and the Christians only believe that only the 12 apostles were at that Last Supper, whereas early fragments like this and other writings outside the New Testament indicate that it was a much bigger affair, which according to Jewish custom it certainly would have been, that his family was there, which would have included his brother James, that his apostles were there, that the women were there, that his mother was there, which would have been really much more in keeping with Jewish community tradition at the time than 12 men celebrating Passover by themselves. So those are the fragments of that. And let's see if I have. Well, I guess we'll stop there. That's enough of the stuff. But those are some of the key beliefs that they continue to believe long after Yeshua was gone about Jesus and what he taught, which you can see is very different than what Paul was teaching. That the law of Moses had been usurped by the grace of Christ and was not in effect anymore. The people didn't have to follow it. Not only didn't Gentiles have to follow it, Jews didn't either, because everything was now Jesus. And you see that the Ebionites and the apostles of Jesus taught about Jesus, taught what he said to them, taught what he taught practices that he did, told stories about his life, told stories about his travels, told stories about what happened to him and where he went, told stories about healings. Paul doesn't have any of that. Paul just talks about the dead Jesus, how he died, and the fact that his death saved all mankind if they would believe in him. And as Paul himself says, I teach only the risen Christ, which he did. And his version of the risen Christ was what he understood from his visionary experience. And he had more than one. The Damascus Road vision was the first, but he had other visions as well as time went on. So his entire teaching of Yeshua, all of it, was based on his inner visionary experience. That doesn't mean it's false, by the way. I'm not even saying it means it's false. I've had visions in my own life that I'm utterly convinced are true and have borne out in my life. And they were inner experiences of mine, as was this thing of Paul. So the fact that it was an inner experience doesn't invalidate it. But the understanding Paul had of who Yeshua was and what Yeshua taught and what was important to Yeshua is very, very different than what the 12 people who were hand-chosen and trained for over 3 years by Jesus, very different than what they understood and taught. So believe, whoever you want to believe, or whatever combination you like, but the apostles were not teaching what Paul was teaching and vice versa, and they did not, for the most part, get along, and they certainly did not see eye to eye on what Yeshua's work was or how they were to carry it out. So that's the Ebionite group, and we know, and you've probably not heard about them in any of your church history or sermons, I'm guessing, and yet it was the most positively immediate successors to what Yeshua actually did and the people he put directly in charge, who were from his own family. Down the road, that same group we can follow it for 15 different successors. Down the road, we see other apostles named in there as well, who would have been very old at the time. And it says they were very old at the time. But mostly family members that continue. If you are interested in the history of that at all, there's a really informative book called The Jesus Dynasty, and it's written by Dr. James Tabor, Tabor. Same as The Mountain, by the way, spelling Tabor. That if you're interested in that sort of thing, it's a history book, basically, a biblical history book on all that. Anyway, so comments, questions, things to add. Once again, you may or may not agree with some of the things that I've read and said about them, like vegetarianism, for example, but they clearly believed it. And that's what we're trying to say is what did they believe and what did they do? So anyway, anybody comments? Something you'd like to share? Questions? Allison, hi, welcome.
Hi there. Fascinating as always. I hate when I have to miss this.
Aw, thanks.
Um, I am just knocked out by this. I cannot wait to get a hold of some of these books, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And what I wanted to add was that I'm not really aware of where this is coming from, but there have been a few things said at the pulpit in my church that certainly indicate that there is, at least in the United Methodist Church, it sounds like there is a real kind of shoving Paul off to the sidelines a little bit.
Wow.
I am paraphrasing. This is not what they said.
Yeah.
But, and I've heard it in a couple different situations, and it's almost like, yeah, I'm paraphrasing. Yeah, we're taking Paul with a grain of salt and maybe a large hunk of salt. So I kept remembering this as you were talking about that. I wish I knew more about it. I'm sorry, I do not. But it's clear to me that contemporary, United Methodist circles must be aware of some of this.
Yeah.
It sounds like in their seminaries.
Yeah.
That's all. I don't know anything more than that.
That's from my perspective. That's great. It is coming out more and more. Different churches are more receptive, of course, than others. But it's a lot of this stuff is it's not. It is all ancient history, but a lot of it was not known ancient history until just the past several years. I mean, some of it about the Dead Sea Scrolls we've known since the 1950s, but some of the other things are scholars that have a lot. It's so fragmented. It has taken some scholars years of just trying to piece together. You have a first century historian here, and then you have a second century letter there, and then you have a Jewish historian here, and then you have a Greek historian there, and all within 100-ish, 150 years of each other. And then you have letters that aren't people writing history, but they're just like, I'm writing you a letter. I send you an email, and they find that, and they go, oh, well, look, this Stephen guy, whoever he is, said this, about in this email to Allison, and what is that? I don't remember hearing that before. Or, oh, that's what it says over here. I wonder if that relates. And they're trying to piece together this big jigsaw puzzle, kind of. So, as more things are uncovered, it's a really interesting picture, I think, that emerges. And it makes sense of one other thing in the New Testament that didn't used to make sense to me decades ago. Many times when Paul is writing to his own communities, like Corinth or Ephesus or these different places where he has communities, one of the things he stresses fairly frequently is, if somebody other than me comes along teaching you about a different Jesus, don't you believe them. Don't you let them into your community. Don't pay any attention to them. Kick them out. Who else was teaching about him early on? I mean, in that first decade. it's not like everybody in the Roman Empire had ever heard of this guy, and everybody, people were talking about it on all the street corners. That wasn't happening. Who was teaching about Jesus back then? Paul and his apostles. So when Paul is saying, don't listen to anybody other than me who's talking about Jesus, there's a real good chance who he's talking about are the Ebionites and the apostles. Don't listen to these people. So, I mean, there weren't a lot of other groups teaching about him at that point in history. So that kind of makes some sense to me. I don't know if that's, I can't say for sure that's right, but I'm pretty sure it is. So Nahama and Julie, go ahead.
It's me, Uncle Stephen.
Hi, dear.
Hi. Okay,
Long time no talk.
That was a raspberry too. Very funny, yes. And I do have one weather update. No rain today, but tomorrow a extreme heat advisory as of a few hours ago of 116.
Oh, ugh.
What time is it?
No, I don't. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Zoom is great. I'm good being there virtually. That's fine with me. Yeah.
Zoom and phone, because unfortunately now that's the only way I can hear you play, which hasn't happened for a while.
Oh yeah. I by the way, I've been exploring that. I think I found a way I can do that next week. That maybe it will work. So. Yeah.
Some fingers. And as I said, James needs his movie review. It won't be every time. But this time, James, I saw the new Spider-Man movie. I wasn't sure if I was gonna see it. So yeah, I saw it, and I actually like this one a lot better than 2 and 3. And the only issue I really have with it, besides the usual of jumping and latching on extremely tightly a time or two in a vice grip, was the camera angles. I am not one when they do 360s and 180s and all those weird, angles where they go in circles. They give me motion sickness, so I don't tend to watch those. So that was one of my main hesitancies, and unfortunately the surround sound was a little high for it as well. And yes, of course, as always, only standard version. I will not see any of the other stuff. It'll always be standard.
You're a purist.
I'm old school. You should know that by now.
I do.
So
cool,
yeah.
thank you. I appreciate it.
No problem. I wasn't sure if I was gonna see it in the theater, so because I'm a bit Marvel out when it comes to those movies. I got that Marvel burnout for a while, so yeah. Okay. Oh,
She did have something to say.
yes, beyond the picking on. Besides the
Okay.
picking.
All right.
Don't worry. The other thing is giving you a finger pointing, Uncle Stephen.
All right.
About so Old Testament, when you're talking about animal sacrificing and Noah's Ark and all of that fun stuff.
Yes.
So I will remind you, there is a thing that after the flood, set of rules for all humans.
Yes.
Before the 10 Commandments, called the Noahide laws.
Yes, 7 of them.
Yes, and those were set in place. And so everything was set with, so like one of them for like animals is you couldn't, besides some of the normal ones that are in both versions.
Yeah.
One of them was you couldn't kill an animal and then leave it still bleeding for another day.
Right.
You had to eat it. You couldn't let it just, leak it out or what, or like cut off a piece and then leave it.
Yeah.
So there was stuff like that, even though.
Yeah, there was. That actually, one of the compromises in the book of Acts that I mentioned that James made with Paul was that James allowed to Paul's followers to only follow the Noahide laws, only those 7. They didn't have to do all the laws of Torah, but they did have to do those. And James said that if Paul did not insist on those at least being followed, they could not be part of any Yeshua community. So that's the ones he was talking about, is the very ones you're talking about. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
Although,
good.
yeah,
Like
so that was good. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you.
And I have nothing.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. All right.
And
Right.
yes, James, I'm pouting. No entertaining shirt today. I'll survive.
Thank you, Julie. Thanks, Nahama.
Yeah, I gotta buy a new one. I gotta buy something new, interesting.
Go ahead, James.
All right. Well, I've been reading a lot about Gnosticism and literally everything in the last month or so, and I seem to remember something from a book where Paul was talking to James, and Paul was saying something about Yeshua, and James disagreed with him, and Paul said, "Well, no, I think you're wrong." And James, like basically paraphrasing, and says, "Well, I was there. How about you?" You know?
Yes.
So I always got a kick out of that one. It's just Paul is a very fascinating character because he's just kind of like inserts himself in this whole thing.
Oh, absolutely does.
You know,
No question.
I'm still trying to figure out why and for what purpose, but I haven't gotten that far yet. But I thought it was quite interesting.
It is interesting. There's a letter, supposedly a letter from Peter, and scholars, argue about whether it is legit or not. But there's a letter from Peter supposedly, and I've now forgotten who he writes to. Sorry, but anyway, in this letter, Peter refers to Paul, and clearly the person Peter is writing to is familiar with Paul's teachings, and he has said something to Peter prior to the letter, apparently about what he learned from Paul, and so Peter writes him back and says, "Oh yes, Paul, our dearly beloved but sorely mistaken brother." so
That's good to know.
Yeah. So I love that though. Yeah, I was there. How about you? That's a really
yeah.
That's
Basically,
really
that's what he said. He's like,
yeah,
well,
right.
You know? You don't get to tell me what happened.
Exactly. I was there. Yeah, exactly. I'm now old enough that in certain spiritual groups that I've been involved in over the years, I now and those groups still exist. I now see certain things coming out of those groups about, oh, this happened, or this person started that, or this person started that, and I was like, no, it was the same thing. I was there. That's not the way it happened, But anyway, for what that's worth, yeah, that's why as you know, historians are always looking to primary sources, as opposed to second and third, down the road. The closer you can get back to somebody who is an eyewitness. Doesn't mean that the eyewitness wasn't mistaken, of course, but the closer you get to an incident, the more likely you are to recover actual information about it, as opposed to things decades or hundreds of years down the road.
I know. I wish I could read Coptic or ancient Greek.
Oh, I know. I know. There's some fascinating stories in the Coptic Bible that are not in any of the other Christian Bibles. Including the death of Mary. The death of Mother Mary is in the Coptic Bible, which is not in any other biblical text that I'm aware of. And so I don't read it either. I just have an English. I don't even have that anymore. I used to have an English translation of the Coptic Bible, but I don't have that anymore. Yeah, surely. No, probably Nahama this time.
It's me this time, and just listening to the two of you talk back and forth, what arose was a group of kids playing telephone.
Yes, exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
we have to take these deep teachings with a little bit of,
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
I don't know what word I want to use. We have to really think through them and see how they resonate with our spiritual.
Absolutely. And the telephone game basically is done within a short time frame. I mean, we're talking the telephone game over hundreds of years. It's just
Exactly.
hard to know anything really, in that sense. But yeah. Yes, so
Oh,
true.
That was all I
I
had.
do have to give a quick book recommendation, book/author to James that I forgot to say
Yeah, go
mention.
ahead.
Dark fantasy author, well, high dark fantasy author Brandon Sanderson. He's the one who finished the Wheel of Time series. One of his well-known bestsellings is the Mistborn books. The first one is called Mistborn. The whole series is called Mistborn, and the first book is called Hero of Ages, if I remember correctly. And that is going to be turned into a TV show at some point. So just an FYI, I recommend it, but it's dark.
Thanks,
So,
Shirley. Yeah.
Thank you.
problem.
I'll look into it.
No problem.
In regards to what Nahama was just saying about the telephone game, oh gosh, it's okay. Well, I'll do this short. The I've mentioned this in other classes, but a long time ago. The earliest collection of the 27 books of the New Testament that we currently have, the earliest collection we have of that is called the Codicus Sinaiticus. And it's old. It's the oldest one we have so far. They keep finding older stuff, but that's the oldest complete collection we have so far. So somebody did, a group of scholars, did a translation of that collection of 27 books and compared it to the 27 books we now have in the New Testament to see how many differences they could find. And during that same time period, basically, there was a new scroll of Isaiah discovered in Israel in an archaeological dig, which that is now housed in the Antiquities Museum in Jerusalem. But that scroll, the Isaiah scroll, was a complete Isaiah scroll, and it's the oldest one that they'd ever found. And it was 1,000 years older than every other Isaiah scroll that they'd found. So somebody decided to compare that, and it's in Hebrew, to translate that Hebrew with, like, just picking up a Tanakh now and translating what the book of Isaiah says in a standard Jewish Bible now. So they did those things, this group of scholars. In the 27 book collection of the New Testament, now versus the oldest one that we found, they found 700 and some differences. I think it was 735. Between the ancient Isaiah scroll and the modern Jewish Bible Hebrew Isaiah, they found 7 differences. So Jews were meticulous about copying and scribe work, and they're, among ancient cultures, one of the more reliable of transmission of historical records because of that. So I found that difference just kind of stunning. So, but anyway, enough of that. I do want to mention that I'm going to do one more on this and talk a little bit more about the apostles and some of what they taught. And I'll bring in, as I mentioned earlier, about Paul and Simon Peter, because they have been kind of commandeered by the Roman Catholic Church as being their people, and that the Roman Catholics is a direct succession from all of them. So I want to share a little bit about historically what's known about Peter and Paul, and that connection. Again, after 135 AD and the Bar Kokhba revolt, the original family and apostles, followers of Yeshua, this Ebonite group and some of their offshoots, you can trace some of the branches somewhat. You can certainly trace some of the thought and belief systems, but organizationally, it's very, very hard to track at that point. It's really scattered because it was a capital crime for so long, and they're hunted and persecuted and literally killed for so long that after the 135 rebellion, the remnants that existed were very, very secretive, and so a lot of it's just lost historically to us at this point. We can make some guesses, and we can certainly see traces of the teachings kind of continuing here and there, or like the Gnostics that James was talking about. You see some of the ideas raising in the Manichaeans and in some of the Cathar groups and things like that. You see some of these remnant thoughts, but a lineage of the organization kind of disappears at that point, and hard to follow. But what's really clear is that the early teachings of Yeshua, which the apostles themselves and his family members preserved for at least 100 to 150 years, that those teachings were overwhelmed by the Pauline teachings and a new Christology that developed, and then a new church that emerged, and most of the original teachings have been lost to us. And the idea that any traditional Christian church right now is the repository of the original teachings of Yeshua historically is really hard to justify. At best, it's hard to justify. So a lot of that's just been lost, and then we have what we have, and we do what we do with it. People of faith, we make of it what we can make of it, and go forward. But there are things that clearly he did teach, and that were taught for 100 years after his death, and there are things he clearly did not teach that are still being taught as if he said them, and we have every reason to believe he never did. So, for me personally, I have reasons for this, but for me personally, it's important to try to bring some clarity to that, and to try to, whatever people want to believe is totally fine with me. It's up to them, but to present something as if it's authoritatively known, this is what Yeshua taught, when it is actually known that he didn't, I have a hard time not correcting that, because I think people are very confused, and more importantly, maybe even than confused, very afraid by a lot of things they think he taught that he did not ever teach. So anyway, that's that. So thank you all for being here tonight again. Sure appreciate it. And we did record tonight, hopefully, so it'll be on the YouTube if you want to refer back to it for some reason. But I'm going to do one more in this series, and then we'll move on from there probably. As I said, I've gotten some suggestions about Melchizedek, and feel free to write me other things you might like me to, do a class on, or a short series on, or whatever. And if I don't know anything about it, then I won't do one, quite obviously. Or if you do know a lot about it, maybe you can do one with us. So anyway, thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful week. And I would, again, just briefly ask for prayer. Ani's mom, as you probably know if you looked at your emails, is going to need a heart pacemaker installed in the next day or so. And she's 92, so it's should all go well, but she would appreciate prayers, and so we're.
I wanted to say something, Stephen.
Yeah, please.
Several people have written back and written very nice things, and one person had written us and talked about the fact that they were kind of hesitant. They've had some of their own health challenges in that area, and they were kind of hesitant about moving forward with treatment and stuff, and that they were inspired that if this 92-year-old woman could do that's like, okay, so I guess I could do that too. So I passed that along to my mom today when I spoke with her. She's still in the hospital, which is irritating her, because she was hoping they'd do the scan today, the procedure tomorrow, and she could go home because she has things to do.
She has projects and quilts to finish. And,
yes,
exactly. Right.
And she's not happy about being in the hospital. So, so I passed that along to her, and she said, well, there's just one thing to do. You just have to get these things over with. which is so much my mom. It's like,
so
well,
typical of your mom.
yes, it is. Well, you just have to get these things done, and then you could go on with life and enjoy what you're doing. So that is her advice, and that's the way she also lives.
Oh yeah, she absolutely does. Yeah, no
So,
question. No.
yeah. So anyway, I just appreciate the prayers. I appreciate the personal notes. Another person wrote and talked about her daughter being the kind of cardiologist who does this sort of procedure and how successful it was. And, she's never had one go south. And so just stuff like that has been very uplifting and heartening. And Hama and Shuli, thank you for your blessings as well and your uplifting conversation. So I just wanted to say all that.
So thank you all. And James, if you get a chance, drop me a note. Let me know how things are unfolding with your aunt's estate and that whole process.
Yeah, I'm back in Texas now. So
I thought you were from their setting back. Yeah,
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Well, thank you. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's just the way it goes. So
yeah.
All right. Anyway, love you all. Have a great week. God bless.